Good afternoon. So we had a great introduction to nanotags. So you're all familiar with the technology. The work I'm going to talk about is Pam Loring's dissertation. She's the brains and the energy behind this project, and I'm just the best at talking about a lot of her research today. And this work is a collaboration between the University of Rhode Island and the University of Massachusetts, Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's all funded by Paton, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, offshore energy. So the issue that we have in Rhode Island, in southern New England, is offshore energy. I think most of you are probably aware there are no offshore wind turbines in North America yet. That will change this fall because there'll be 5 turbines are in the process of being built off of Block Island right now. And these green blocks represent federal lease blocks. So here's Rhode Island. Rhode Island is actually an island. So here's Rhode Island, Block Island, where all the Merlins are tagged. And so federal lease blocks here. Here's where the operational wind turbine is going to be. There was, you might have heard of Cape Wind, which has been an ongoing effort to try to build up to 100 turbines in Nantucket Sound. That's pretty much dead in the water right now, though. And then these federal lease blocks, there's a plan for up to 100 turbines, but that probably won't happen for at least a decade. So, as I just mentioned, there are 5 turbines that are going to be built off of Block Island. The foundations were put in last summer, and the turbines are going to be put on the foundations this year and done in August. So these are huge towers. These are 6 megawatt turbines. So each tower will be 590 feet tall. So they're as large as any turbine in the world right now. So Block Island, quite currently, the energy to Block Island is from a diesel generator, so they have to bring the fuel out on a ferry once a month. These 5 turbines will now is enough energy to produce for 17,000 homes. There's only about 1,500 people that live on Block Island during the winter months, and so there'll be excess energy that will go on the grid to the mainland. So the question, obviously, is what potential impact might these offshore turbines have on avian populations? And particularly in southern New England, there's 3 federally listed species. Piping plover is one of them. So piping plover is federally listed as threatened, at least in southern New England. There's also roseate tern, which is federally listed as endangered, and red knot, which is federally listed as threatened. So I'm going to talk about the research on piping plovers today. You're all familiar with nanotags. In the case of our birds, we put 1 gram nanotags on the birds. They're set to get a signal every 5 seconds. So it weighs about 1.9% of the body mass. And our tags will last about 163 days. So the array that Pam has set up is, there were 17 towers that were established as part of this project in our study area to look at the movements. We're not only looking at piping plovers, but roseate and common terns too. So each of our towers are about 40 feet tall. There's 6 antennas that come off of the antenna. And depending on the flight elevation of the bird, they can be detected up to 40 kilometers away, based on the data. So this last year, we put nanotags on 25 piping plovers in Rhode Island and another 25 at Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge to look at their movements throughout the region and how they relate to these offshore lease blocks. So the first dilemma we had was how to catch the piping plovers, and I think maybe a lot of you are probably aware that in southern New England there's lots of efforts to manage piping plovers. Lots of the nests are exposed, and so my first thought was, well, if the nest is exposed, how am I going to get inside that exposure to catch the bird? And luckily, Jonathan Cohen has this ingenious technique. So what we do is the exposure's been in place for about 2 weeks before we tag the birds. And then we just go with a section of hardware cloth. And at the back of the hardware cloth is a funnel. So with 3 or 4 people, we can attach this hardware cloth around the edge of the exposure. It takes about 2 minutes. But then we leave a section in the front that's still open for the birds to go in. So we back away, and then we let the bird come back and initiate incubation. And you can see a plover incubating inside this trap. Then 2 or 3 of us will just walk towards the open section of the trap. plover will walk to the back of the trap. It's a hardware cloth, so it can't get out. And then eventually you just funnel it into the funnel on the back of the trap. And there's a funnel on the back of the trap that's got a mist net funnel. And it's trapped and we can catch it. It works really well. The nice thing is it keeps it away from the nest too, so if there's, you wouldn't want to break an egg. So it's a quick, easy way to catch the birds. So it takes about an average about 9 minutes to catch the birds. If within 30 minutes we don't catch the bird, we have, based on our permit, we have to leave and come back 48 hours later on to try and catch it again. But generally we catch them on the first time within 9 minutes. We also, in some places with a nest where there isn't exposure around them, we just have an individual walk-in trap. And you can see there's a drop door just held with a string. The bird goes to incubate, and then we drop the door, and then we walk it towards the back in the same funneling system. This is a lot at Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, so you sit there and you hide behind the closest vegetation so you're not limited. But it works pretty good. It works very well too. So you just they come with that there very quickly. So we were successful 93% of the time in the first capture attempt in getting the plovers. Once we get the birds, then we glue the nanotag on the back of the plover in the interscapular region, and you can see here's the antenna coming through the back. And so, as I mentioned before, these are 1 gram tags, so it weighs about 1.9% of the body mass. We also put these alphanumeric flags on them to recognize individuals, and that's useful for keeping track of movements, and I'll talk about some of the observations of these content birds too. So it took us an average to process the birds, it took an average of about 18 minutes from laying it, measuring it, attaching the tag, and attaching the color bands. You can easily tell piping plovers apart. The males have the bright yellow bill with the sharp black tip of the bill. The females, it's not as bright, diffuse black, and then the amount of dark on the head is much more distinctive on a male than it is on a female. You can age the birds the second year based on the amount of feather wear on the tips of the primaries as opposed to an after second year bird. So we have good information on the age and sex of the birds too. The blue represents the nanotag birds and the red represents controls. And this is the number of chicks fledged per pair. And you can see that there's no evidence that the birds that have nanotags affected the fledging success of the chicks. So that was good news. One thing we did notice immediately after caught the birds, that they would immediately go into the water to bathe. A lot of you probably experienced that too. You don't normally see piping plovers taking a bath. So the question is, does it adversely affect the behavior of the bird besides they come and take a bath after they're being held by humans? So we did a series of activity budgets looking. The blue represents nanotag birds and the red are controls, and we looked at various behaviors. The bottom line from this is that we didn't see any evidence that it affected foraging behavior, preening behavior, territoriality, any evidence that it had adverse effects on the behavior of the birds. So that was good information for us to provide to the Fish and Wildlife Service too. So how long are the nanotags retained on the birds? So this just shows the number of days from banding and how long we tracked them for. So the median, the number of days we tracked them was 48 days. As we tracked one individual up for 98 days after it was banded. Not all the nanotags that we glued on the back were retained the entire study period. So you can see that 17 of the 50 birds dropped their tags prematurely. They dropped them at about day 25 on average. For those birds, though, that we had documented the outflight was about, the median day was around 50 days after we abandoned them. So they're retained on the birds for about 2 months before the outflight took place. So Stu talked about the departure behavior. We're interested in the departure behavior too. This just looks at diel variation and when the birds are leaving and starting their outflight of the long distance migration. And so you can see the birds, the red represents Massachusetts, birds from Monomoy, and the blue is birds from Rhode Island. So there was a tendency for the birds and their outflight to leave around between 4 and 5 o'clock when they're leaving Monomoy. The birds in Rhode Island tended to leave a little bit later, right around dusk. So anywhere from 6 o'clock at night to 9 o'clock at night is when this is when they're initiating their migration to head south. So as most of you are familiar, shorebirds in general, they're going to leave at dusk to initiate these long distance flights. And the same thing based on what we're seeing for piping plovers. So the great thing about the nanotag and having this network is we can really get a really distinctive track on how these birds are flying and how they're leaving the region. So again, this shows a track of one individual bird. So this is an after second year female. She fledged two chicks on the 23rd of June, and then she initiated her migration on the 4th of July. So about 12 or 13 days after she fledged her chicks. And you can see the migration was initiated by spiraling upwards at first, and a lot of you have probably seen that when you see shorebirds take off the migration. You see them circling up higher and higher, and then they start to head in the direction they're going. So we thought that maybe piping plovers would hug the coastline, going towards the coastline towards Long Island Sound, but this bird actually headed farther south. It went just north of Block Island, and then this is Montauk, this is the tip of Long Island, so it went off the tip of Long Island and departed our study area. So this distance, it was traveling at approximately 80 kilometers per hour. Took about 1 hour to get from Statuesque to Montauk. The one bird is we also had another tower, so it was picked up that next morning at 4 o'clock in the morning in New Jersey. So if you do a straight line distance, it would average, suggesting it's traveling about 55 kilometers per hour. They probably don't travel that slow, so my guess is we don't, as Stu also mentioned this fact, we don't have any towers in this section, so it's probably hugging the coastline closer than this straight line would depict. So it's probably going along, and we'll know, hopefully we'll get more towers this year, we'll have a better idea about the exact flight path. Here's just one other flight path, example of a flight path. So this is a bird at monoline after second year male. Took off did the same kind of spiraling behavior first at 7 o'clock at night. Then went across Nantucket Sound and then departed by the time I made to the western end of Nantucket. It was about 8 o'clock at night. And then that bird was detected down at Assateague, Maryland at 7 o'clock the next night. So this is a flight path that suggests a straight line flight path at about 24 kilometers per hour. Again, way too slow. So it's taken the route that it's actually taken is probably much more hugging the coastline than this straight line path depicts. So we need, as Stu has alluded to again, we need more towers to get some great data on the movements of these birds. So if you take all the movement directions and weather direction flight paths of the plovers taken from Rhode Island, so most of the birds from Rhode Island are actually heading towards Long Island Sound. Four of them took this other route that I showed you before, going off of Montauk and then going along Long Island. The interesting thing for those birds from Monomoy, most of them are going between, this is Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, they're going a more straight line direction over the Atlantic Ocean to leave Monomoy. We had one individual that actually headed north and disappeared too. So we're starting to get much better handle on the flight paths of the birds through our study area. The other thing is we can look at things, what are the age and sex of in terms of departure dates. And so the dotted lines represent second year individuals. So the blue is females and the red is males. So you can see that the second year birds tended to leave first, then the females tended to leave before the males. And this just shows the cumulative percentage of plovers that by age cohort that left our study area. So most of the birds are starting in the to leave our area about the middle of July, and by the end of August, that all have left Rhode Island. We can also look at how does nest success affect departure date. So you can see that we have a limited sample size for failed nests. So this second year female, they tended to leave earliest. Successful after second year females that were successful left earliest, and the ones that stuck around the longest in the study area were those ones that were unsuccessful in their first nesting attempt, which makes sense, because piping plovers will re-nest if they have a failed nesting attempt. The other final thing I want to mention is because we have a lot of these birds color banded, that a lot of these individuals were resighted on the wintering grounds. And so what we can see is that Cape Hatteras, a large number of our birds after they left our study area are seen in the Cape Hatteras area during fall migration. So I don't need to read the dates, but a lot of observations in July, August, and September. We had one individual, though, that made it all the way down to Fort Myers, Florida, within early August too. And then most of our birds that were seen during the winter months were seen in the Bahamas, and Bermuda, and Turks and Caicos was the farthest bird that our birds were seen. So we had a large number of our color-banded birds were observed. So 44% of the birds that we banded in the winter months from Rhode Island were detected, and 24%. So we're really getting a high percentage of our birds seen during the winter months. The plans for this year, Pam has really extended the network, so there'll be many more towers going through the mid-Atlantic. These are all the offshore lease blocks in this area. So that this year we're going to put out another 50 nanotypes on piping plovers, 60 on roseate terns. We had 30 on roseate terns last year. I haven't talked about those data. 60 on common terns, and then there's going to be 250 red knots that will be out there to track the movements of the birds. So we have a much better indication of movement ecology of these federally listed species through an offshore area. That's it.